is the There Is Another Way podcast from spencerbruce.com. Making life work as a creative. Hello boys and girls, Brucey here with this week's There Is Another Way podcast, coming from you from my nearly empty home. Yes, I am moving. I may have mentioned this in the last podcast. I'm moving house, going through all the process of packing, decluttering, sorting everything out. So it's very empty here, so it might sound a little bit more reverberant today because of the fact there's not very much here. It definitely sounds a little bit echoey to me. Hope you all had a great week. Hope you enjoyed the podcast last week with Andy. Hope you got a lot from that. I certainly did. I certainly found a lot of the stuff he was saying really interesting. I certainly found his ideas about career changing fantastic. And also, I suppose the main point for me was that, you know, when you go to these groups, it's really encouraging when you meet people with similar ideas to yourself. That's the big thing for me. When you realise you're not alone, you want to do this, it's on your mind, but there are other people out there doing it. They've got tips, tricks and advice. Then it makes you feel a lot more comfortable and a lot more better off about making the choices you might be making. Today's show, today we're going to talk about something which I find really liberating when it comes to creativity. And this is the concept of limitation. And I'm going to give some really useful, I hope, examples and anecdotal experience of how when you limit yourself, you actually probably become a lot more creative. And yeah, I'd, again, as always, love to hear your thoughts on this. Please do check out There Is Another Way podcast on Facebook. Post your comments, post your thoughts, post your suggestions, and grow the community. That's what I'm really trying to do. So yes, on with the show. Back to the news. As I say, my most important news this week is I'm moving house, which is a pretty big deal. As I mentioned before, I'm going through and decluttering, and that's being a really massive weight lifted off me. It's amazing how much stuff, and there's still a long way to go. Even though I've only got 2 days to move, I'm still going through stuff and getting rid of stuff, and it really does feel immensely liberating, and I'm so glad I've got the opportunity to do it, but I've got a lot more stuff to get rid of. Other news for me, played a really good gig at the weekend at the Soundbatch Festival. That was great. We were kind of headlining the stage in the town centre. It was fantastic. Surprisingly for the UK, we had amazing weather. I was totally taken by surprise by the weather. It was a really great crowd. And of course, when I'm in a band, it ends up being a bit like Spinal Tap, so we did have a couple of Spinal Tap incidents, which no gig would be complete without something strange going on, such as the guy revving his motorbike behind us when we're trying to play delicate acoustic songs for about 2 songs, and then being stopped by a massive procession. But hey, that's rock and roll for you, and that's the reason we do it, for the weird and bizarre things that happen. My other news as well is actually there's a podcast out there that called This Man Thing, and I was fortunate enough to be interviewed by Jessica for that. So the tables have been turned on me, and the whole the piece was about creativity. So if you want to hear me talking on and on about creativity, the importance of creativity, the importance of education, and the importance of creativity in education, then do go and check out that. I'll put a link in the box below. So, today's topic, limitation. In this day and age, I do find we have access to so many things. We've got access to everything, pretty much. Okay, I'll raise a caveat there. I'm not talking I'm talking when you're a creative. I'm not talking about, yes, some of us are struggling for food. You know, we don't have access to all those things. But as creatives, with the tools we have at our disposal, we've got pretty much access to things beyond our wildest dream. And now I'm thinking as a musician, as a photographer, as a filmmaker, what I can do with my equipment, all the options I have just blow my mind. And for some of the software I have, musical software, I could probably spend the rest of my life going through the patches, going through all the things you could possibly do with it, and still never completely come to grips with what the software can do, or all the options it has, or all the facilities or plugins it has. It's just immense. And the thing is, and I've always thought this, and it's been going on for years, that these thoughts, you know, does it make us any better? Are we producing better art? Are we producing better creative content? Are we producing better better content, full stop? You know, think about the writer. before Word, what did you do? You probably sat there with a notebook and pen. You got the pen out and you wrote, or you had a typewriter and you'd write and you'd write. And you wouldn't worry about things like fonts, or should that word be in bold, or paragraphing. And again, I've talked about this as well, as some of these issues are probably down to procrastination. When you've got all these options at your fingertips, it makes it easier to procrastinate as well. But just think back to that. Think back if you're writing a book these days, you fire up the laptop, you open Word, you open Pages, you open whatever it is, you write in and you start typing, and you probably write a paragraph. You'll go back, you might format it, you'll think about the font you're using. You've got so many fonts, so many things you can do. But it kind of distracts, I think, from writing. Now, I look at it from a musical perspective and think about, the fact when I first started writing music in my bedroom many years ago, I had a little four-track cassette player even, and I was fortunate enough to have a little keyboard and my guitar. And I may have mentioned this before on the podcast, but wow, I wrote so much material in those days. I just used to write because nothing was distracting me. I wasn't producing studio quality recordings, that's definitely for sure, but I was writing. I was honing my skills writing music. I was enjoying it. It was a creative process. And when I couldn't do something, when I didn't have the tools to do something, I tried to find out about what it was I needed to do, and that's a really useful, inquisitive process of how do I've got this problem, the volume keeps going all over the place. What do I need? And I go, oh, that's a compressor. And I knew what a compressor was and what it did and why I might need one. And maybe if it became really important, I would save up and buy one, and then I would get this compressor, and it would be kind of basic because that's what you might be able to afford. But you'd really use it. You'd really get to grips with it. You'd use it inside out, and till you wore it out almost. If those things are possible. But you get my gist. And I was just more creative. That's the simple part of it. And you think back to perhaps the Beatles. Famously, they recorded on a 4-track machine. And with 4 tracks, you can actually what that means is you've got 4 different instruments you can mix together. Going back to the days of Elvis, they recorded in a room, and they positioned people in a room and they just went for it live. And it was, cut onto a record. That's why it's called cutting a record. And that was it. No room really for mistakes. A couple of takes, boom, you do it. Jump to today. I have on my machine unlimited tracks that I can use. 1,000 tracks, 2,000 tracks. I have more compressors, or access to more compressors, digital compressors on my machine than I can possibly even count. And they all do different things. Ironically, most of them trying to emulate the great compressors of studio days gone by. I've got 1 million amp models. I've got 10,000 different synth sounds as opposed to like 3 or 4 that I used to have. I find it really limiting my creativity, and it's a real important issue that I want to address here. Again, going back to the Beatles, they had 4 tracks, and with 4 tracks, if you start being creative, if you go, well, we actually want to do something creative here, what can we do? Well, they actually managed to get it up to 8 by doing this process called bouncing. And out of 4 tracks, you can actually get 8 tracks. And what would you say about the Beatles? They stand the test of time. They with 8 tracks, they produced the most amazing music that lives through history. Beethoven, what did he have? He had a pen and a piano. He didn't have any of that stuff. And we're still playing his music. And again, there are so many things you can talk about. I think about this in terms of film as well. These days with digital cameras. Some of the films I've been on, you do take after take after take after take. What does it matter? It's just digital. We'll just comp it all together. We'll just do whatever we need in post-production. We'll just shoot and shoot and shoot, and we'll just go and get some more cheap media and keep shooting. Think about back in the days when we were shooting on film. Film is and was pretty expensive. It's even more expensive now. So people were limited to the amount of takes that they had. So they really had to nail it. Actors had to nail it, had to know what they were doing. And importantly, creative decisions were made there and then on the spot, just like the process where the Beatles went through with bouncing. The process of bouncing takes, you record 3 tracks, you mix those 3 tracks together onto one track, and then that frees up the remaining 3 tracks to re-record onto. And then you can record onto another 2 tracks and bounce those down to 2, and then you've got 2 more tracks which adds up to 8. But when you're bouncing down is the process of, say you have the bass and the drums, you are mixing them there and then. That's it. Once it's done and you erase over them, they're gone. And you've made the decision of the mix. People today spend weeks, months on mixes because you can keep tweaking. You don't have to make creative decisions there and then. You can go back, undo. I was very fortunate enough to work in a studio which still worked with tape, and you used to splice tape together using a razor blade. You took the physical tape, you made your edit, and you cut it, just as they used to do with film as well. There ain't no undo with that. You can't undo. So, let alone multiple levels of undo. So I hope you see the point I'm starting to get at here. We've got amazing abilities with digital technology to do things. The same as, again, with photography. I'm totally guilty of this. I remember having a film camera, and you used to buy film, and it was kind of, not super expensive, but it was consumable. And you'd have your 36 or your 24 shots, and you would kind of think more carefully about taking pictures. Now you might just take 36 pictures of one, hoping you'll get one right. That's a massive issue, I think, in terms of creativity. You're not making decisions, you're making decisions after the event rather than making decisions during the event. And I think if you have to make creative decisions on the spot, they might be wrong, they might be right, but you've made a decision. And I think that's really, really important in terms of creativity. I certainly know that this is a process I tell students to do, is the limitation exercise. This is what we're talking today. It's like, for example, you're mixing a track. You're only allowed one compressor. Which compressor do you choose? You're only allowed one EQ. What do you choose? You are only allowed 36 shots. You're going out for a day's photography, you've got 36 shots. You can't undo, you can't delete any. What are you going to do? How are you going to take your pictures? What are you going to take pictures of? Do you see what I'm saying? You start to get in the mindset more. You start to notice things more. You start to arrange things more. When you're limited, you are more creative. End of. I'm sorry, again, feel free to call me on this one, but you really are. And of course, don't get me wrong, with modern technology, particularly in music technology, particularly with film, some of the things you can do, some of the music we have today is because of these tools that we have at our disposal. But again, I think a lot of it is from people, a lot of stuff, the kind of, hip-hop stuff coming out today, the kind of grime music I'm hearing in the UK. It's guys in their bedrooms really limited with the software they've got. Very limited funds, as it was back in the day with punk and all those kinds of genres, making the most out of their instruments. This juxtaposes with what you see on internet forums, where everyone is so busy discussing cameras, guitars, pedals, amplifiers, probably in writers' forums, pens and paper, and what's the best. Oh, you can't be a writer unless you're using a Moleskine notebook. The kind of things. This is what happens on the internet, but no one's creating. Where is the creativity? If you look for the people who are creative, they're the people with probably the smallest amount of items at their disposal, and they're using them creatively. This is another aspect of the limitation exercise. When you don't have something, let's say you're doing some photography, you're doing some sculpting, I don't know, you're making a film, and you don't have a helicopter. How do you and you need a helicopter in your film, how do you do that? How do you start to be creative? Off the top of my head, you could just hire a big fan and use the sound effect. A lot cheaper than hiring a helicopter. You could go back to the cheesy, really bad films of the 70s and maybe use a model helicopter. Get someone to CG, to create, animate a helicopter. There are many things you can do, but when you're put in that limited position, when you don't have access to something, you start to be creative if it's important. And that's it's the issue here. If it's important, and you start to realize what things aren't important. You go out, you got your 36 shots, you start to think, well, That's kind of an interesting picture, but it's not exactly what I want. I'm looking through my eyes rather than looking through the viewfinder, which is what I think we do a lot now when we, again, I'm saying probably guilty of this. I'll go out, take 2,000 pictures, and then spend ages going back. And that's another thing as well. It's that time. You should be moving on. You've taken your great picture, you move on to the next one, rather than constantly tweaking, constantly looking to make that picture perfect before you show anyone. You've got to move on. You've got to learn from that experience. You've got to look at the things you've done. This is another great thing about limitation, is if you've created a track, you've created a picture, you've created a film, you go, you know what, it's not exactly what I wanted, but I can see what I want now. I can see what I need to use. This is also important in terms of equipment, because if you limit yourself to the equipment you use, you start to get a really good understanding. And this is something that really, really gets to me. And again, I'm guilty of this. Don't get me wrong. I'm being a hypocrite here, but I'm really guilty of this. But I do tell my students, this is a really important factor. Know your equipment. My synthesizer that I had when I was very fortunate enough to be bought it as a teenager, it was my synth, and I loved it. And it didn't do very much, because that's what synthesizers did back then. But you listen to the music from the 80s, and the synth, you look into the scores of John Carpenter, all kind of synth-based scores. These are amazing. They worked within the limitations and the confines of. Now you've got access to everything. Are things getting better? I don't necessarily think so, because people aren't being as creative, or they're not making decisions. And the synth I had, going back to the point I'm trying to make here, I knew it inside out. Because it didn't have 1,000 options, it just had a couple of oscillators and a couple of filters and a couple of, an envelope. And I just learned what it all meant. I understood it. I could use it. And this is something I do now. It's even on my computer, I have to tell myself, I'm limiting myself to one synthesizer. I've got Logic Pro, which I use, an Apple product. Comes with, I can't even count, probably 20 different types of synths and plugins and pianos and sound making. I try and just tell myself, use one. Try and make a whole track from one synthesizer. If it doesn't do exactly what you want it to do, that's where you become creative. That's where you use your mind and your creative eye. Say, how can I do this with the things I've got? If I've only got one synthesizer, but hey, I've got some guitar pedals. Maybe I'm going to put the sound of this through a guitar pedal and see what that does. Oh wow, that's awesome. That's unique as well. And this is another point. When you are creative, when you limit, you become unique. Don't sound like everyone else. Your pictures don't look like everyone else. Your films don't look like everything else. Your sculpture doesn't look like everything else. Your writing probably isn't like everything else. And again, as we've always said through this podcast is for everyone. We talk about creativity quite a lot, but creativity is the same in business. When you've got a million options on Excel or Word or whatever, you're not developing. You're just spending time faffing. Again, like with a report. How many times do you write a report and then spend a week going back, looking at all the options, changing the font? Oh, do we need... You have to make creative decisions. And I've noticed a bit of a backlash to this too. I was looking at an artist last week, and unfortunately I can't remember his name, but what really struck with me was that he is deciding that with again, this is for a bit musical, but then again, that's my background. But what he does with certain musical software, you input what's known as MIDI data. You don't actually record the sound, you record information about the sound, and then you can manipulate that to your heart's content. Change different sounds. It's how synthesizers work, and sample players and things like that. But what he was doing like the process that talked about the Beatles. He was playing something in. When he was happy with it, he kept playing it in. When he was happy with it, he recorded that performance. So he couldn't go back to the MIDI data and arrange it and change it. He was like, I'm now stuck with this is my performance. Just like going back to the great performances of yesteryear. Elvis, I'm sure, was probably wanting to make a few tweaks to some of his songs, but he couldn't. That recording was the recording. The decisions made in Sun Studios were the decisions made, and that was the track that was put out. Yeah, legendary. They couldn't, who knows what would happen if they could then go back and keep changing things. What are we going on? I want to keep this one a little bit quick today. I might have to revisit this subject because, as you can tell, I'm really passionate about this subject. But time is against me this week. limit yourself. That's all I'm saying. Think about your practice, think about your business, think about whatever you're doing and limit yourself. Maybe just have one pen for a week. See what you write with one pen. If you're going out doing some photography, just think, okay, I've got 36 shots today. That's it. That's my film. I can't afford any more. What am I going to do? What pictures am I going to take? Oh, I've already taken 10 pictures. I've got 26 left. I'm going to make those pictures count. I'm really going to think about the picture now, not about just fixing it later or taking 1,000 and seeing if I get, anything hits. Because if you take 1,000 pictures, you're probably going to get one that hits. But maybe if you took 36 and you really think about the pictures, really think about the composition, really think about the lighting, wait for that moment, you're gonna get more hits out of it. If you're making a film, your actors, 2 takes, that's it. Get them in the zone as well. If they know they've got 2 takes, you've got to nail it. If you know in your mind, again, it's psychological. If you know you've got 100 takes that you can do, or it doesn't really matter, because it's digital. Hey, I've heard this, actually heard this say, it's digital, we'll keep going till we get something. I'm not shitting you. I've heard that, that is common. It's also common in music recording as well. Back in the day, the studio artists of the day, they'd have maybe 1 or 2 takes. You got to nail it. That's it. Nowadays, you'll just loop forever. And I'm guilty of this. I am really guilty of this. And it does lead on to another discussion of how perhaps as musicians or as filmmakers, we're expected to do everything now. We are expected to be the editor, the cinematographer, the sound recordist, the photographer is supposed to be the photographer, the lighting person, the guitarist is supposed to be the recording engineer. Back in the, maybe that's why skills are being watered down as well. And I'm not saying there aren't some amazing people out there who can do everything, but there always are in life. But at the same time, many of the great recordings of our era were recorded by people who are focused on doing one job. All I'm asking you this week is just try and limit yourself. And you can apply this into many other aspects of life. Limit yourself to one type of clothes that you're going to wear, and then see how you get on. Maybe you've got a wardrobe full of clothes and you don't actually need them. You can get rid of them. There are so many aspects about this. So I do apologise for wrapping it up here, but I hope you understand that I am moving and normal service will be resumed next week. Thank you very much for listening. Once again, please do subscribe if you enjoy the podcast. Please do tell your friends. And signing out from Wilmslow Road in Manchester to Adventures New. Catch you later.